Welcome to History 1302, the Roaring Twenties, Part 1 of 2. This presentation is going to talk about the 1920s, and our thesis statement is, what makes the 20s roar? Now, the answer is not just all the things that we're going to talk about in this presentation, but the fact that all of these things are happening at once. Our thesis statement, what makes the 20s roar? Our idea is all the things that we're going to discuss here, but it's all these things happening at once. So as a lead-in slide, we're talking about economic downturn. We will talk a little bit about the Treaty of Versailles. This is kind of a repeat of what was on an earlier presentation, but the Treaty of Versailles kind of sets up what's happening next in the 1920s, so it kind of belongs in both places. So we'll talk about the Treaty of Versailles, then we'll talk about economic downturn, Red Scare, we'll talk about the Klan, then we'll take a look at women's votes, then Prohibition. Then we'll take a look at the broader issues. Now that'll be in part 2, consumerism, Art Deco, the rise of the automobile. We'll also talk about some social issues. We'll talk about Scott's monkey trial. Politics, we'll talk a little bit about foreign policy. That'll be the Dawes Plan and the Young Plan, an issue which gets overlooked by many historians. In an era of isolationism, we do have a foreign policy. Then we'll take a look at the politicians. That'll be Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover. And then we'll take a look at the crash. Now, as we look at the Roaring Twenties and answer the question, what makes the 20s roar? Please understand that these do not have to be positive things. These can be negative. When we talk about the rise of the Klan and this continued racism and terrible treatment of African Americans, that is clearly a negative. But the setting here is that it is also extremely dynamic. There will be a bright spot to that, and we will talk about that. The crash, clearly an economic downturn of that nature, is a negative. However, it's dynamic, and so we're going to talk about that. So what makes the 20s roar? All the things we're about to discuss, and the fact that they're all happening all at once. So with that in mind, let's move forward, and we're going to talk about the Treaty of Versailles. Here we're looking at the Treaty of Versailles. Now, I set this up. I discussed this in an earlier presentation. I'm going to repeat it here because it kind of belongs both in the 1920s and in an earlier presentation that is at the end of the First World War. So to set this up, what we're describing here is the treaty that ends the First World War. So the main figures that are involved here are Clemenceau, David Lloyd George, Orlando from Italy, and our own president, Woodrow Wilson. Now, late in 1918, the Germans had reached out to the Americans through back channels, diplomatic back channels. They'd gone through Sweden, and they transmitted to the Sweden so that the Swedes could talk to, the Swedes were neutral, they could talk to Wilson about this. And they're asking for some way to end the war. Now, Wilson can't talk to them publicly or directly. He has to go through a neutral because Germany is obviously, and Germany and the United States are at war. So Wilson has come up with the 14 points. Now, the 14 points represent an equitable peace treaty. I'm not really going to discuss the 14 points because they went exactly nowhere. If you want to look that up, that's your business. You know, it's in the textbook, and that's fine. But it's not going to go anywhere. So the Germans get this message, again, through the Swedes, and they say, okay, under those circumstances, we can talk. And then militarily, they kind of have to, they see that they're in the line. And so at a very symbolic date and time, November the 11th, 1918, at 11 o'clock in the morning, that is to say 11 o'clock in the morning, on the 11th day of the 11th month, 1918, there's an armistice. Now, the Kaiser Wilhelm II, he is going to abdicate and head towards Holland, and he's going to live out the rest of his life in Holland as an exile. So the Germans that show up in Paris for the treaty are a new government in Germany. And they say that they opposed the war, they wanted to end the war, they didn't have anything to do with it, and they are a new government. And they're very hopeful, they're very optimistic about the 14 points. That's what they're expecting. Well, in effect, they are arrested by the French, this German negotiating team. They're negotiators from Berlin. They're arrested in Paris, thrown into a hotel room, and said, "Stay right there." Now, the story is that this is supposed to be some kind of a protective custody to keep the French crowd from like ripping them to pieces. Okay, fine. But in the meantime, the Allies are negotiating the actual treaty. So Wilson arrives. He's only the second president ever to leave the United States as the president. The first one had been Teddy Roosevelt, and he'd only gone down to Panama to like help build the canal. So Wilson's here on a big diplomatic mission. He's acting as his own Secretary of State, and he's much celebrated. You know, he's got this tremendous education. He's got this big reputation to be a peacemaker. America is very much celebrated as having aided during the war. And so he gets there, and they begin the negotiations, but he negotiates basically in isolation. And what I mean is that Clemenceau and David Lloyd George, they cannot sign an equitable peace treaty. Politically, they would go back home, and after all this massacre and blood and treasure that has been spent by Britain on the one hand and France on the other, they could never, ever, ever go back home and say, listen, we let the Germans off the hook. That's not an option for them. So kind of privately, publicly they're playing along, but privately they're saying, we're never going to do this 14 points business. So Wilson is isolated. Well, the negotiations go on, and the Treaty of Versailles is formulated. And for that, let's go to the other part of the written portion up there, kind of on the upper left. So when we talk about the Treaty of Versailles, 386 articles. Obviously, you don't have to read that, but it can be remembered as an event by an acronym, BRAT. And so very briefly, let's go over this BRAT business. Let's go over that really quickly. So B stands for blame for the war. Germany must accept all blame for the war. That's basically written into the Treaty of Versailles, and Germany has to accept blame for the war. Now, it's my position and the position of many historians, and even people at the time, that said, no, there's enough blame to go around. But Clemenceau and David Lloyd George, effectively, they can't go back to their population and say, we're going to let Germany off the hook. So they have to blame the Germans. That then leads us to R. R stands for reparations. And for many of you, that should ring a bell. This was one of the requirements of the Prussians, the Germans, onto France in the Franco-Prussian War 1870-1871. We talked about that. And so for the French, this is sort of a species of payback. Well, Germany has to accept blame for the war, therefore they have to pay for it. They got to pay for all the damages. And the amount was like astronomical. The cartoon that you see down there says $55 billion, which would be many trillions in today's money. But here is the strong note that I want you to take on reparations. Reparations were designed to destroy the German economy for at least 20 years. The French in particular, but the British as well, went to the German banks, cleared out all their national bank. They cleared out all the gold and silver, all the hard currency. So the German currency was then only backed in paper. It was just paper money, just backed on a promise. And so German people really quickly lost confidence in that, and we will talk about that later. But their economy was wrecked up. The French are going to go into the Ruhr Valley, which was the industrial heart of Germany at the time, and they're going to tell the German workers, everything that you guys produce, we're simply going to take it, and we're not paying for that. Well, the German workers went on strike immediately and said, well, we're not going to produce anything then. Well, a few of the strikers got shot. The French army simply shot them. And the rest of them went back to work in a conscious acknowledgement that they're just going to work really hard and get this thing paid off really, really quickly, and then that would be that. Well, it didn't work out that way because the broader German economy collapsed pretty quickly. Again, we'll talk more about that later. But this was designed to destroy the German economy for 20 years, and that very nearly worked. It is the United States that will fix that, and we will talk about that. The A in Brat, armed forces are restricted. 100,000 man army. Please write that down. No reserves and a 100,000 man army. Now that made the German army smaller than the Czechoslovakian army. It made the German army smaller than the Belgian or the Dutch army. And the Germans were very conscious of this. Germany had always taken a great deal of pride. Generations of Germans had taken a great deal of pride in their army, going all the way back to Frederick the Great. And so this is a tremendous slap in the face to the German people. Furthermore, there's no navy, and this really suited Great Britain. Great Britain said to the German Navy, you know, those ships that are in the German Navy now, they've got to be sailed to Great Britain and basically turned over to the British. And the Germans were like, well, okay, we will do that. And they did. After a while, they're going to manage, the sailors will get really upset, and they're going to deliberately sink their own ships in this British harbor. Those ships are still there. They're just wrecks at the bottom of the sea. Fine. But this destroyed their navy, a navy that the nation had worked really hard to build up, and were modern ships, and had actually done quite well during the war. Last but not least, armed forces are restricted. Strong note. No Air Force. No Air Force. One of the paragraphs actually talks about a specific type of World War I aircraft, a Fokker D-7, that they can't have that one anymore. Well, you know, the Germans weren't going to develop the Fokker D-7 anymore. But the point of getting rid of an Air Force, strong note now, is that that's where the technology was. That is where the technology was at. And so there's not going to be any more technological development through the German Air Force, because that's been completely wiped out. And this cripples Germany for the future. Last but not least is territorial loss. Last but not least, territorial loss. Germany loses all of their overseas territories. Again, that should ring a bell. To be considered part of great power status, you had to have overseas colonies. That was like one of the elements to get into that good old boys club. But Germany's going to lose all their overseas colonies. They had an overseas colony in China, in Tsingtao. They had an overseas colony in German East Africa, modern-day Kenya, Tanganyika. They had islands out there in the Pacific that were really important for them as coaling stations. We've already talked about that. And so this is really this brought Germany down. So they lost all their overseas colonies. Obviously, they also had to give back Alsace and Lorraine. We've already talked about that as well. Alsace and Lorraine had never been part of Germany. That was part of the prizes that Germany got after the Franco-Prussian War, 1870-1871. And that had never been part of Germany, and so that has to go back to France. Well, everybody kind of expected that. So, on analysis, and I have it down there underlined, Germany feels betrayed. They went in here into the Treaty of Versailles expecting an equitable peace treaty. That did not happen. The 14 points that were supposed to be part of that did not happen. Everybody had high hopes for the League of Nations. That did not happen. Germany was deliberately excluded from that as a snub. And so, strong note here. The Germans feel as though they are victims. This gives a strong sense that they're victims. And that's unfortunate. That will have consequences later on. Now, the last thing I want to say on the Treaty of Versailles, kind of on the whole, many historians over many, many years said that the Treaty of Versailles indicated that the Treaty of Versailles led directly to World War II. And now a modern generation of historians, of which I'm a part, disagree with that. When you take a look at the elements of the Treaty of Versailles, this blame, reparations, armed forces restricted, and territorial loss, strong note now, all of that will be solved by the early 1930s. All that's going to be solved. So Hitler's going to take over in 1933, and most of these things are meaningless. Most of the elements of the Treaty of Versailles have already been abrogated. And then by 1939, when the war starts, nobody's even talking about the Treaty of Versailles anymore. Nobody's even thinking about that. So the underlying causes of World War I are not even remotely connected to the underlying causes of World War II. And the Treaty of Versailles, as an underlying cause of World War II, that is not in any part connected with the actual outbreak of war in 1939. It has nothing to do with it. So, in other words, all the underlying causes of World War II are utterly different. They have nothing really to do with the Treaty of Versailles, except to, like, abrogate it. Well, nobody stuck up for the Treaty of Versailles. That's not why anybody went to war in 1939. So, the Second World War has to be considered a stand-alone conflict. Modern historians just disagree that the Treaty of Versailles led directly to World War II. It just did not. It doesn't stand up to meaningful scrutiny. All right, so with that in mind, let's head on to the next slide. So, the Red Scare. This is an issue that's going to affect America. It's a tremendous issue right immediately after the war. So let's set this up, and that's the first bullet point that I have up there. Immediately after World War I, there was a short, sharp depression. Now, the underlying cause of this depression is actually easily traceable. It's easily identifiable. America had been in this industrialized war, and we had turned into a manufacturing powerhouse because of the war. We were supplying the French, we were supplying the British, and we were supplying our own guys. And this is just, we built things for the war. Well, we didn't know how to, like, slowly let down from that. Wilson was very, very ill by this time. He'd suffered a mild stroke, and so he wasn't really in control. The Federal Reserve was a brand new entity. Nobody was really running economic policy. And so in the immediate aftermath of World War I, strong note now, the government went in and immediately canceled all of our wartime contracts. They canceled them all at once. Now, that's not how it's done. If you want to cancel these contracts or slow these things down, you do it in increments. As it turns out, we did that after the Civil War. We slowed things down incrementally. But here we're going to cancel all these contracts all at once. Now, imagine if it's something like something straightforward, something rather simple. Imagine you're a uniform manufacturer, and you'd gotten this contract for a vast number of uniforms, millions and millions of uniforms. Well, you're the one that's actually making the uniforms, but then you, in turn, need raw materials. So you go to cloth manufacturing. You say, listen, I want this kind of cloth. It has to be wool. It has to be with a cotton blend. It's got to be this color. It's got to have this many buttons, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And so you have all the button manufacturers. You get them lined up. You have the dye manufacturers. You get them lined up. You have the cloth manufacturers. You get them lined up. And so you have all these different manufacturers, subcontractors, supplying material. Then along comes the government and says, listen, we don't need those uniforms anymore. Cancel the contract immediately. Well, the clothing manufacturer then immediately has to, like, lay off a bunch of these people and then tell the dye manufacturers we don't need that dye, and tell the cotton manufacturers we don't need your products anymore, the wool manufacturer, the cloth manufacturer, we don't need that. The guys that supply the buttons, we don't need that anymore. And so in turn, all those people, they stop manufacturing. Well, apply that to all the materials of war, food people, logistics people, artillery manufacturers, gun manufacturers of many different sorts. The guys are coming up with canteens and backpacks and hats, shoes and boots. So, by canceling all of these contracts immediately, it initiated a short, sharp depression. Now, I have also up there an arrow that's pointing towards strikes. So, strong note here. During the war, American labor, who had fought very hard, we've already talked about this, had fought very hard to get unions and to get, good treatment. During the war, they very patriotically said, listen, no matter what happens, no matter what, we're going to work, no strikes. And so, I'm sorry to say that many American manufacturers took unfair advantage of that. And they said, well, we'll make you work longer hours, and we're going to cut your pay, and we're going to take away safety devices, and we're going to kind of maltreat the workers in order to maximize profits again. And the workers, American workers, worked very loyally, and they said, listen, we weren't going to strike, and we won't. But then the war was over with. And so many of these guys went back on strike in order to, get their gains back. slightly better pay, better, working conditions, all the things that they'd fought so hard to get. So on analysis here, short, sharp depression, and then there's going to be strikes after the war, not during the war, but afterwards. So on analysis, we have a short, sharp depression, and we have an unhappy workforce. Well, can we blame the president? No, we're not going to blame the president, and in fact, we're not going to blame the government because we had a successful war. We're absolutely ecstatic about the victory, so we're not going to blame the government. Well, we're not going to blame manufacturing. They'd done a great job there. They'd supplied everything. They were like working. We're not going to blame the workers. They are saying publicly, loud and long, listen, we worked patriotically during the war. You can't blame them. So, strong note here. The people that unreasonably get the blame are immigrants. We're going to blame immigrants. The people who are least able to defend themselves against this, this public dislike are immigrants, and they're going to get the blame for the whole thing. And it's really, really unfair. So the next bullet point, there's an unreasoning fear of anarchism. Europe, especially Central Europe, was descending into chaos. Germany, Austria, Hungary, their economies were wrecked up. They were defeated militarily. Their governments were discredited and in a state of chaos. And so there was upheaval and overthrow and, fighting in the streets. And this was seen as anarchy. And so all immigrants coming to America were suddenly seen as anarchists. And this is unreasoning. There's a real and perceived threat of the spread of communism, okay? Before the war, there was no such thing as communism. Then, in 1917, there was a communist overthrow of Russia. Now, Lenin said we're going to honor all of our treaties because he didn't want to be discredited, and so they tried to fight on. But the Germans kept beating them badly. And so finally, Lenin, after a very short period of time, Lenin said, we've got to have a separate peace treaty. And so they did. And immediately, just a short period of time later, in all this chaos, Lenin says, well, let's attack Poland to try and grab some territory back. Let's try and spread communism through a military overthrow. And so there was this real fear, this panic about communism. The evil communists are coming to get us. Well, the people that are carrying communism to America, of course, they got to be the foreigners. They got to be these immigrants. Which was completely untrue, obviously, but it is an unreasoning fear. So, as it turns out, there was a Wall Street bombing. Now, there's several stories about this. The one that seems to be most accurate to me, a genuine anarchist, somebody that was really, really unhappy for whatever reason, was evidently had one of these mobile hot dog stands sort of thing that you see all over New York City today. These mobile little eateries. He went down to Wall Street, and we'll never know why he did what he did because he mistimed the timer, and when he set up the bomb, it blew up and killed him too. So we're never going to know what actually was going on here, what the cause of this thing was. But everybody hit the panic button. They're like, oh, wow, these commies are out there. They're coming to get us. They're coming to get us. And there was this unreasoning fear in the nation. So I'll talk about toleration of the Klan in a moment. But this unreasoning fear leads to the case of Sacco and Vanzetti, the Sacco-Vanzetti case. Now, again, there's several different versions of this. I'm going to give you the one that I think is the most accurate. Because of this short, sharp depression, in Boston, there was a lot of people that were out of work, and there were a lot of things were going really, really rough. So as it turns out, there was a robbery, a payroll robbery, and quite a bit of money was involved in this. Well, in the investigation, it seemed like it was probably an inside job. But under any circumstances, one of the guards got killed. And essentially, he was portrayed as being law enforcement. And Americans, to this day, right now, we react really, really strongly when law enforcement is killed. We don't like that at all. So there was a dragnet. That is to say, you go out there into one of these areas and you just round up the usual suspects. And in this dragnet, there was Sacco and Vanzetti, Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti. You can see that's their picture right there. It's them. Well, during the investigation, they just wanted to pin somebody for this murder. They wanted to pin somebody down for it. They wanted to pin somebody, you know, the money. They wanted to like get somebody like had to be found guilty for this. So these two guys got it, and they barely could speak any English. At the trial, Sacco had to actually have an interpreter, an Italian interpreter, to tell him what was going on. And they were poor, and they didn't have a whole lot of money for the trial. So they were found guilty. Now, strong note here. Once they were found guilty, then it's unfortunate that people understood that the wrong people got, you know, the guy that actually did it, he was back in Italy, as it turns out. But they were found guilty, and they were almost certainly innocent. And then they actually got good lawyers for the appeal. And so the good lawyers, they said, okay, we're going to dress you up in some nice clothing and have a nice photograph taken of you, and that's the photograph that you see here. Well, again, during the appeal, it became clear that one of them, Sacco, I'm pretty sure, during the time of the crime, he was actually in the Italian embassy. His father was sick back in Italy and was trying to get a visa to go back to Italy. One of them was found with a gun, and it turned out that the gun was not the gun that was used in the crime. And so, you know, they had some like crude forensics, and that was not the gun that was used. So these guys had been railroaded. But under any circumstances, after appeal after appeal after appeal, because they were foreigners, because they couldn't speak good English, because they had, you know, iffy representation in the original trial, their guilt just continued on, and they were electrocuted. Almost certainly they were innocent. But they are the icon of the suspicion of immigrants. Please write that down. Sacco and Vanzetti are the icons of this suspicion, this unreasoning fear of immigrants. Now, I've mentioned this before in class. Immigrants are going to be the target. This is going to be a dynamic that like affects the United States even to this day. So that's the first perspective that I want you guys to be thinking of. The second element, and I have it up there, is the toleration of the Klan, which will be the very next slide. Okay, and I'm sorry, the slide after the next one. The next one is going to be a lot of images and pics, and we'll talk about the rise of the Klan. So last bullet point up there, reinforcement of isolationism. Americans want to be isolationist. America got nothing out of World War I. Then we had this short, sharp depression, and then all these, you know, communists and anarchists are evidently, this is the mood of the American people. We're coming to get us, so the best thing to do, just America, just do it by yourself. Stay out of everything. All right? So with that in mind, let's go to the next slide. There's going to be some images of the Red Scare. Now, I want to tell you plainly that some of these images are racist, but this is what education is all about. So let's go take a look at this and do a little bit of image analysis. So what you're taking a look at here are cartoons that have to do with the Red Scare. But first I want to talk about the one that's labeled up there, The Passion of Sacco and Vanzetti. Now again, you can see this kind of cartoon that's drawn of these guys, and that's a reflection of that earlier photograph. And I urge you all to read this. I urge you all to read this. In class, I actually read this when I'm doing a face-to-face. But I want you guys to read what it says. Now, this is a sort of it's not a manifesto. It's just saying, listen, this is what our thoughts are as we're about to be executed. And you can see that Vanzetti, who probably wrote this, his English is kind of bad, but it talks about understanding of man's understanding of man, of justice, tolerance. They're not talking about, we're innocent or guilty or this, that, or the other. They're saying, listen, please try to make something better out of our death. That last sentence down there, that agony is our triumph. Okay, they know they're going to get executed for a crime that they almost certainly had nothing to do with. But they want their death to mean something. Now imagine if you're basically getting strapped into the electric chair, and can you produce something like that? No. These are not stupid men. They're not ignorant men. They're thoughtful and, just good, ordinary people. With that in mind, let's take a look at the image analysis up here. And you can see in all these cartoons, there's really a theme going on here, but let's take a look at it. In the upper left, I'm kind of particular about who calls me brother, and you can see American labor is there, and the American labor is the patriotic American. And then the guy that just got knocked down, he's the foreign extremist, the Bolshevik. He's got a flag laying down there, and it says red right on it. You know, they didn't do a color cartoon in this case, so you had to put the flag had to be red. Moving over kind of clockwise, there is Karl Marx. Karl Marx had been dead for 10 years by this time. But there he is. Again, he's got his flag going. It's red. He's got this, bomb going on, the Industrial Revolution. And there's Karl Marx. Very famously, as some of you may or may not know, when communism was being exhibited in Russia, Karl Marx, who was very much older by that time, he had to actually come out and say, listen, I'm not a Marxist. In other words, even he acknowledged that his message, his ideas, his political theories were being taken completely out of context. And this idea of Marxism and communism is just simply a revolutionary overthrow. And, a faction wants to grab power. And they're just using his ideas and ideology as a cover for a power grab. That's all there is to it. In the slide up there in the upper right, you can see there's Karl Marx again. He's got a blowtorch called Anarchy. He's cutting down the American flag. And, that kind of gives you an idea of the zeitgeist, the spirit of the time. That lower image, you see this guy like selling some kind of medicine, and it's supposed to be cures whatever ails you, and it's Bolshevism. And there's the American farmer. And he's like, do I look unhealthy to you? Do I look like I need a cure? I don't need that. I don't need your medicine. But there is a theme running through all of this that I want to draw your attention to. And in my view, it's pretty much racist. Take a look at how all of these foreigners are being portrayed. Look at how the different artists in all these cases, portrayed foreigners. The guy that's gotten knocked down in the upper left, again, if you take a look at the bottom of his shoes, that kind of concentric circle thing, that means that he's worn out the bottom of his shoes. And his coat and his jacket and his pants are all rumpled up, and they're clearly like wrinkled. You go over to Karl Marx, and his jacket is all ragged at the bottom. He needs a shave and a haircut. His hat is all rumpled. His clothing is ill-fitting. It's got a patch on the elbow. There he is, really sitting with this ridiculous-looking prop. Again, he's like clothing is all like just dusty and dirty and nasty. And at the bottom, this snake oil salesman, he needs a haircut and a shave. His clothing is all rumpled up and it's baggy and it doesn't fit right. And so that's how foreigners are being portrayed. They're unwashed, and they're filthy people, and they're wearing bad clothing, and they can't seem to take care of themselves. They're second rate. They're just trash. And that's never true with immigrants. Never. Immigrants want to fit in. Immigrants that come to America today, they want to fit in. They look at how other people are dressed, and they try to dress that way. So what you're looking at here is just this continuing trend, this ideology that permeated American society that foreigners are to be despised. And that's really a bad situation. So with that sort of image analysis in mind, let's go ahead and talk then about the real effect about this Red Scare, and that is the rise of the Klan. Now, here you see what's going on. The Klan responds to this Red Scare. There's a short, sharp depression, threw a lot of people out of work, and so the Klan, they reemerge. The Ku Klux Klan had always been there since the Civil War, but they'd taken this low-key approach, and they were just kind of hanging out. They were doing what they were doing, which is bad enough. But because of this Red Scare, you see the Klan really coming out strong. Those guys are going to really make a mark. Take a look at this image up there in the upper left, as you can imagine. There are 20 or 30,000 Klansmen with these stupid sheets and this crazy hat, and they're out there with American flags, and they're marching right down, right there in Washington, D.C. They're making this big, giant parade. And so that just is kind of indicative. We'll take a look at the other two photographs in a moment, but let's take a look at the verbiage there. 1925, 40,000 Klansmen march on Washington, and that's that image that you see up there. There's lots of publications and newspapers, and there's all sorts of things out there. Strong note here. The Klan is trying to reinvent themselves as an equitable, protective society. That is false. That's a cover story. It has nothing to do with the truth. There are two new things that are going on with the Klan as it reemerges in the 1920s. Strong note here. Number one, they're hating a lot more people. The Klan is a hate organization. They've always been a hate organization. They are today. But they're hating on a lot more people. They're hating on Catholics. They hate Jews. They hate Hispanics. They hate African Americans wherever they may be found. They hate gays and lesbians. There's just a whole lot of big giant list of people that they hate. They'll say, they'll go out there and beat the crap out of people, and they'll say, well, they're in a marriage, a common law marriage, and we want them to go down to the courthouse or go down to a preacher and actually get married. We don't like common law marriage, and so they'll keep saying, listen, we're trying to protect society. We're trying to uphold these like tremendous American values, but they're using violence to do that, and that's not the way it works. That is not the way it works. The other issue that is completely different about the Klan, number one, they're hating a lot more people. Number two, they are no longer limited to the South. The Klan is everywhere. And that leads us to these other two photographs. Up in the upper right, you see they have a float in a parade. Red, white, and blue, stars all over the place. Hey, Ku Klux Klan. Well, that is in Peoria, Illinois. They're up there in the north now. In the lower right, you can see a big giant Klan initiation in Long Island, New York. So the Klan is all over the place. They're on the West Coast. They're in the upper Midwest. They're in the Plain States. They're along the East Coast. They are no longer limited to the South. So many join in the 1920s to defeat communism, and then they find out they're in an organization that's just there to oppress people, go after foreigners, go after immigrants, go after, hate on all these different people. So they get local vigilance committee, vigilantism, and that's like really, really spectacularly bad. So in the broader sense, and I'm not trying to, there's plenty of blame to go around on this, and the Klan is like bad enough. And they are an evil organization. They were then, and people understood it. But the presidents at the time, Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, they tolerated this sort of thing. Whereas earlier presidents, Grant in particular, they were like, no, they recognized the danger of the Klan. They recognized what it was really all about, and they tried to crush it. Now, I'm going to go on with a little bit of image analysis on the Klan. And the next slide, I'm telling you guys right now, and I want you to be prepared for this. The next slide is brutal. I do not sugarcoat history. I'm not going to do that. And here is a very dark chapter in American history. What makes the 20s war? The rise of the Klan. It's not a positive thing. It's a negative thing, but it is also very, very dynamic. People are responding to this fear, but they're just exhibiting their fear in the wrong way. You have the rise of the Klan. But the consequences are extremely negative, and that is exemplified in the next slide. So, this is really what the real consequences here are Plessy v. Ferguson. This is what Plessy v. Ferguson did. But then when you have the rise of the Klan, then you also have a terrible, terrible events going on in America. So let's just face up to it and take a look at what's going on in the lower left. Now what you're looking at here, ladies and gentlemen, is a lynching. A triple homicide has taken place. All the people there, they found 3 black men. Evidently there wasn't enough room on the pole there to hang all 3 of them. They hanged one, murdered him, and then cut him down and hanged up the other 2. Lynched them. All of the people that you see in that slide are accessories to capital murder. Every one of them is an accessory to capital murder. It could be that they're accessories after the fact, but the result is identical. They're accessories to capital murder. And a photograph was taken. One of the guys there is smiling. Many of them are smiling. And They turned it into a postcard. These are the things that African Americans are facing. And it's horrible, horrible, horrible. Plessy v. Ferguson, the court case said, listen, this segregation business, you can do that. And so we've identified this minority group, and they're putting them under a terrible, terrible constraint. And it seems to make it okay for people in this Red Scare to go out there and murder young black men. With that in mind, take a look at these images in the upper left. Colored seated in the rear, drinking fountain, white or colored, colored served in the rear. So you see these signs are everywhere. And John Marshall Harlan had said in the Plessy v. Ferguson case, he said this is going to be a badge of servitude, the segregation, and there you have it. There it is. And there's no escaping this, especially in the South. They have all these Jim Crow laws, all these black codes, and those are being enforced. So anywhere African Americans go, they're being segregated out, and they're being, treated really, really badly. The idea behind Plessy v. Ferguson was separate but equal. Well, separate out absolutely means different, usually lesser. One is better than the other. And African Americans are faced with this every day, every day. In the upper right, you can see a poster, a sort of a symbol that has really, really long legs. And this went on for a long, long time. That's Thomas Nast right there. And so he's going to make this in the 1870s. But then as late as the 1920s, you can see this kind of poster is going to be reprinted everywhere. And there's the Civil War soldier, the Confederate soldier. There you can see a black man's being hanged in a tree. The South as it was is the banner across the top. Worse than slavery. That's what it says right there by the skull and crossbone. And then the Klan and this Confederate soldier are shaking hands. And they are absolutely dedicated to holding the black man down. Take a look at this image at the lower right. And this is what an African American school looked like in the 1920s. And you might say to yourself, well, in the 1920s, that might not be so bad. It might be kind of what you might expect in that era. But there are some things missing there that I want to draw your attention to. By this time, by the 1920s, electrification had taken place for a long time, for quite some time. And so can you imagine a white school being without lights? There's not even a lantern. So the only light that you get in this school is through the windows, and that's it. That's all you have. The students have a blackboard, probably just a couple of big sheets of plywood painted black. They certainly have like natural chalk. I can kind of see it there. Natural chalk is just the stuff you get out of the ground. In other words, not chalkboard chalk, it's just natural chalk. They have crude desks. Well, okay, that might have been something that you would expect. But there's no lights there. There's also no way to get warm. There's not a pot-bellied stove or any way to actually get warm. And so we're talking about a really crude sort of building where these students are at trying to get an education. And so when we talk about this, I want to be clear. So African Americans are getting a really, really bad education. And this affects them throughout their entire life, negatively impacts them. Last but not least, I want to draw your attention to what I have written up there. In the time frame we're talking about, between 1890 and 1930, there's 3,400 African Americans are lynched. This is an illegal murder. This is a vigilance committee. So, strong note here. In the era before the Civil War, there was somewhere between 115, 120 people, maybe as high as 150, lynched, murdered illegally by a vigilante committee throughout the South, through the southern states that were later involved in the Confederacy. But as it turns out, statistically, about half of those people were white. They committed some other crime, or they were doing something else that they should not have been doing, or they got murdered, or whatever the case may be. But it's about 50% black and 50% white. After the Civil War, the numbers are about the same, about 150, 180 per year throughout the South. The difference is that they're almost all black. Almost all the lynchings that took place in the immediate Civil War era and after the Civil War right up to the 1930s were all black. And so the South is they're deliberately, willfully oppressing the African American community. And so that's kind of what you're seeing here. This is what life was like in the 1920s. So what made the 20s roar? Well, in many places is this horrifying situation of continued oppression of the African American community. However, there is a bright spot. There is a bright spot. And so, with the next slide, we're going to talk about this. Now, what I want to talk about for a few minutes here is African American migration. There is a bright spot. And I want you guys to write really, really good notes here. In other words, there's a lot of connections that we need to make before I can paint a clear picture on this. So first, throughout the 1920s, there was an economic upturn. Please write that down. Throughout most of the 1920s, there was economic prosperity. And African Americans actually benefited from that prosperity. So, strong note, continue on strong notes. There's an economic argument, but then it'll have a social outcome. So, African Americans, especially in the South, were limited to microeconomies. In other words, African Americans could only deal economically among themselves. They couldn't actually participate in the larger economy in the South because they were black. But they're also very industrious and they work really, really, really hard. And so the African American community is going to start making a little bit of money. So strong note now, as the macro economy prospered, trended towards prosperity, the microeconomy and the African American community in the South trended towards prosperity as well. There is a time lag. I'll say it again. As the macroeconomy of the 1920s trended towards prosperity, the microeconomies of the African American community in the South trended towards prosperity as well. In other words, goods and services that African Americans might be able to provide were actually supplying in some way the white community as well. Well, that means that African Americans could make a little bit of money. They could get a little bit of money. They trended towards prosperity. And within their microeconomies, that began to generate money as well. So let me just very quickly give you an example. Let's say you're an African American woman in the South, and as it turns out, you're a hairdresser, and you're actually pretty good. So all the other women in the community, the African American women in the community, come to you. And you're an African American woman, and you're doing business, and you're making a little bit of money. And so you tell your husband, listen, I want to actually make a little bit of a shop. I want to turn this into a business. So he goes out and he finds some lumber and he goes and gets some saws and he gets nails and he has to go to different places, different suppliers to get the things he needs to make his wife a shop so they can make a little bit of money. Well, so he's having to take money from her business and go get the materials he needs to make her a shop. Well, that means he's spending money to make money. But in spending this money, what do those people do with the money that they make? They supply this guy with nails, hammers, and lumber, plumbing supplies, electrical supplies. What do they do with the money that they make? Well, they spend it. And the only place they can spend that money is in the African American community. So the community itself, these microeconomies, begin to trend slowly, and there is a time lag, but they tend towards prosperity. Strong note here. This is the bright spot, ladies and gentlemen. Here we go. As soon as African Americans made enough money to get out of the South, they got out of the South. There's a gigantic internal migration. As soon as African Americans could get out of the South, they did. Observe the map that's kind of down there in the lower left, and especially that area of the map that's that light blue, that sky blue color. And this is the time frame that we're talking about. During the war years when money was made, and then during the 1920s when the economy trended towards prosperity, because of consumerism, which we will talk about later, as soon as African Americans could get out of the South, they did. Strong note. The numbers are hard to come by, but most demographers agree that in that decade of the 1920s and the 1930s, almost 3 million African Americans are going to leave the South in that 20-year period. Late 19 teens, throughout the 1920s and the 1930s, about 3 million African Americans are going to leave the South. They're heading up into the north. They're going to go to Chicago. They're going to go to the big manufacturing cities. They're going to go to New York. They're going to head to all those big cities up in the Northeast. Today, when you go to these big cities in the Northeast and the upper Midwest, there's a very strong, vibrant African-American community. And in our American mythology, well, they've always been there. That is not true. Before the 19-teens, 20s, and 30s, there were almost no African-Americans in the Northeast. None. Well, now African-Americans can actually take advantage of that. Because with no African-Americans up there, there are also no Jim Crow laws. There are no black codes. Because there had never been an African-American community up there to actively oppress. Continue on with strong notes. This is the bright spot. So when African Americans arrive in Chicago, Detroit, New York, Philadelphia, wherever in the upper northwest, in the Northeast and the upper Midwest, there's a strong tendency for them, strong note now, to self-segregate. In other words, African Americans want to go where other African Americans are at. There's just a strong tendency to do that. They're coming from an area where they had been segregated, so that's their lifestyle. So they tend to self-segregate. Now, there's some channeling of the white community into constructing African American communities in the South, segregating them. But here's what's important. African Americans are hardworking. They are striving. They're really working really, really hard. So, because the Northeast has no black codes and Jim Crow laws, they could immediately begin to climb the food chain. They could start climbing up the social ladder. They can become local law enforcement, local firefighters. They can become teachers. They can go to school and become lawyers. They can actually start businesses, and they can start moving up. They're going to work towards prosperity. The economy in the 1920s trends towards that, and so they actually have a really, really strong chance of moving up. Now, with that in mind, let's take a look at the image analysis here. Let's do some image analysis. Now, you can see in this image in the upper left, that's Union Terminal. It says right there on the photograph, Union Terminal. It's a railroad station. And there are a couple of things that are going on here that I think is important. Number one, even in Union Terminal, which is in Washington, D.C., they are still being segregated. Washington, D.C. is just right across the Potomac River from Virginia, which was heavily segregated. And so they're being segregated. However, look at how they're dressed. Jackets, shoes, they have luggage, everybody's wearing a hat, they have ties, many of the men have ties on, and all the women have, nice clothing on, and so they're well dressed. Now listen, you gotta think. They did not buy that clothing in a white shop in the South. That did not exist. They couldn't do that. So they had to buy this clothing, get this clothing from other African Americans, which means that there were African American clothing stores that catered to the African American population. Plus, they had money, so they spent it on a little bit of clothing to get dressed up a little bit. They want to appear like, like they're upscale. They're not going to dress in rags. Take a look at the next photograph, a very famous photograph. We know a lot about this photograph. It is these people that are traveling, early 1920s. You can tell that from the clothing, the way the men are dressed. Again, they're taking the railroad, and they stop to have the snap taken. And you can see the men and the women, even the children, are well dressed. They have shoes, they have jackets, they have nice clothing, they've got their luggage, and they are on the move. They're getting out of the South. Last but not least, the photograph on the lower right. This is one of a series of photographs. They've stopped for whatever reason. They're taking a few snaps. And take a look at what's going on. Number one, they have a car. Now, it turns out this is a used car. In another picture, on the driver's side fender, front fender, it's like wrecked up. So it's a used car. But they were able to get it. They had to buy from probably an African-American dealer or somebody that was willing to sell a car to an African-American. Fine. But the car is completely loaded. They have things. Everybody is relatively well dressed. So they made money in the South. And then they're hitting the road. They're getting out of there. They're taking their car. They packed up all their stuff. And they're getting out of the South as fast as ever they can. God bless them. I hope they made it. Now, we will revisit this later on when we talk about the Harlem Renaissance, but we'll talk about that in a different context. That'll be on the second half of the 1920s presentation, because I want to be talking about the growth of the economy, and that's a better place to put it. But in conclusion, on these two slides, just bear in mind, as the macroeconomy of the United States improved because of consumerism during the 1920s, the microeconomy of the African American community in the South also trended towards prosperity. And as soon as people of the South could make money, they got out of the South. And this will have tremendous consequences for African Americans everywhere. They can move up the social scale, they can move up the economic scale in the North, because there are no black codes, there are no Jim Crow laws to hold them down. And they do that within a generation. They're doctors, they're lawyers, they're teachers, they're mayors, and they're going to have a tremendous positive contribution to society, which is as it should be. All right, so with that in mind, let's move on then. Again, what makes the 20s war? African American migration is very, very dynamic, a bright spot. When you talk about this rise of the Klan and this oppression of the African American community, here's a bright spot. But let's move on and let's talk about women getting the vote. So what makes the 20s roar? Women's suffrage. This will wind up being the 19th Amendment. Now, women's suffrage was a long-term issue, and I've touched on this before when we talked about the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, especially the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment, as you guys will recall, had given black men the vote. And I said that you were going to need this, and now you do. So black men got the vote because of the 15th Amendment. Fine. Well, immediately, white women said, well, now listen, politically, that puts black men ahead of white women, and we kind of don't like that. To their everlasting credit, the people that initiated women's suffrage said, listen, we're going to try and get the vote for all women, not just white women. We're going to try and get the vote for all women, black women as well. But the people that started this, that initiated this movement, they said, we're going to try and work within the system. There's not going to be any violent overthrow. They wouldn't put up with any militarism. They wouldn't put up with militant women out there, demanding the vote. They were going to work slowly and within the system. Now, the people that are involved in this, especially, are going to be Susan B. Anthony. I have them in there in parentheses. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Your book talks about a big meeting that they had in Seneca Falls in New York, and there was a giant convention there. A lot of women attended, and many men attended. And they said, listen, women deserve the vote. Now, very briefly here, there's going to be, throughout the nation, there's going to be kind of a conservative pushback to this. And men had a really, a shallow sort of reason for not giving women the vote. They said that wasn't supposed to, it wasn't a thing, and women were like, there was a sexist sort of approach to this, that women didn't have the capacity for this. But the one that probably, that you see the most often in terms of the counter argument for women getting the vote is that politics was a very dirty, ugly business. Now, that's really a revealing commentary on politics. This is the era of the political machine. We've talked about that before. And women were going to have to get involved in these political machines, and they were dirty and they were filthy, and there was a lot of backroom deals. And men were like, listen, that's not a place for any woman to be. It's not really a place for most men to be. And so women need to understand that, politicking is actually a dirty, filthy, nasty business. And they need to stay well clear of it. Well, of course, that just made women all the more anxious to get involved. Maybe as women we can clean this thing up. So under any circumstance, a strong note here, a pattern emerges. And then let me draw your attention to then the map in the upper left. A pattern of women getting the vote emerges. Strong note here. So the 15th Amendment, that comes along in the early 1870s. And at the time, many of these western states were just then trying to enter the Union. Now for this, you need to go way, way back. And if you have to go all the way back to federalism, you got to go all the way back to 1789. And this is the Northwest Ordinance. Now, the Northwest Ordinance, very briefly on this, because I don't want to have to go too far back in history, but the Northwest Ordinance provided a mechanism for new states to enter the Union. And the Northwest Ordinance, 1787, I think I said 1789 just now, 1787, Northwest Ordinance, 1787. The Northwest Ordinance 1787 said when you have 30,000 voters, you can become a territory. A region can become a territory. And the central government will install a governor. They will assign a governor. And when we reach 60,000 voters, then they can become a state. And their constitution, they can write that up. That needs to be submitted. And the only thing that the constitution, the state constitution, has to guarantee is a republican, that is to say, a representative form of government. And then they can be admitted to the Union. Well, in the Northwest Ordinance 1787, a voter was identified as a white male landowner. Again, I've talked about that on several occasions. And so here we are in the 1870s, 1880s, and all of these states are coming into the Union in the West. So the states got permission from Congress, and they initiated this, and they said, listen, it's up to the states to identify who a voter is. The states can do that, which is perfectly true. And so the states, to come into the Union all the faster, especially out there in the West, gave women the vote up front. So if you're in a state like California, which went from being, it really didn't last long in the territorial phase, it went from being a region right straight to being a state because of the gold rush in 1848, 1849. But when you take a look at states like Nevada and Utah and Oregon State and some of these others, well, there's not much population there. They're having a hard time getting to the 30,000 people, and they're having even a harder time getting their 60,000 voters, 30,000 voters and the 60,000 voters. So to come into the Union all the faster, which is what they wanted to do, and that's what was going to happen. The territories identified women of a certain, income, of a certain value in money, or a certain age, or, some other criteria as voters. And then as voters, they could enter the Union all the faster. You could achieve your 60,000 voters like really, really quick that way. And that's what's going to happen in Nevada. This will happen in Idaho and in Oregon State in particular. They have a big population. They don't have a very big population now. But they achieved their 60,000 voters by giving women the vote. So this idea of giving women the vote begins in the West and moves east. This dynamic of the states giving women the vote begins in the West and moves east. So throughout the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, many of these states out there, Colorado, you can see them up there, Kansas, even Oklahoma, South Dakota, they're going to give women the vote. Then the upper Midwest, Minnesota, and all those other states, they're going to give women the vote. In the East Coast, they've already done that in many of these states, New York in particular, Michigan, and then some of these other New England states will do that. Now, think of this as a constitutional amendment. Again, you have to have, two-thirds in the Senate and the House, and then it goes to the states. You got to get 3/4 of the states, and then you can come back and get 2/3 and 2/3 again in the House and Senate. So the only way women are going to vote as a constitutional amendment is that everybody has to agree with it. But think of the number of states. So the western states have already given women the vote. Then the upper Midwest says, okay, we're going to give women the vote. Then the Northeast, they say, okay, we're going to give women the vote. New York was early on in this, but the other Northeast states are going to give women the vote. So they've achieved the number of states necessary to get women the vote. The last of the holdouts, as you can imagine, is the South. Now, the South was conservative. They were heading conservative. They didn't like to do this. They had religion grounds for doing this. They had sociological reasons for not giving women the vote. But the story, which I really do like, is kind of twofold. But I'm going to give you the story that it may or may not be exactly the truth, but I actually like the story. So the House and the Senate had voted, sent the issue out to the states. The states had all voted, and the holdout was going to be Tennessee. And the senator from Tennessee, in other words, it's come out of the House and it's gone over to the Senate for ratification. And the senator from Tennessee, it boiled down to one guy. And there he was in Washington, D.C., and he started trying to call his mom. Well, the story goes that he called, back in those days, you had to set the telephone call up. You had to organize it, make a reservation for this telephone call. So operator after operator after operator had to contact one another in a pathway to Tennessee. And then you can imagine some country store out there in Tennessee, the phone rings, and it's like, hey, we need to get so-and-so on the phone. All right. And so they go get this senator's mom and get her on the phone. And then operator after operator from Tennessee back to Washington says, I have your line. Your party is holding. Then they had to get to the senator. And so somewhere a telephone rings. Yes, what can I do for you? All right. And the senator is there and says, okay, I have your line, sir. And the phone call goes, hey, Mom, do you want the vote? And Mom says, yes, I would like to have the vote. And so the senator from Tennessee said, listen, because Mom wants the vote, we now have the vote. Another story has it done by telegram, but that's not as exciting, so I didn't tell you that story. So women got the vote. Now, I do have there, women do organize. The movement is being paralleled in England. Women begin to mobilize and organize. In World War I, women in England, and this is important because women in America are going to use that as a model. Women in England said, listen, we're going to stop this women getting the vote issue, and we're going to work hard, and we're going to go really hard. We're going to take our men's place in the manufacturing. But they expected the reward to be getting the vote, and that worked perfectly in England. All the English politicians have been holding out as well to make sure that women did not get the vote, and for the same reasons. But then women exhibited this patriotism and this hard work, and they were in the factories. And so British politicians relented and said, okay, because women have done such a great job during the war, we'll go ahead and give them the vote now, which is what happened. Well, in America, the suffrage movement is on hold as well during the war, except for Alice Paul. And Alice Paul was more of a militant, and she protested the war, and she disagreed with the war, and her story is very, very compelling. She was out there in front of the White House every day protesting the war, and she wanted the vote, and she insisted upon the vote. One day, the story goes that she was out there protesting along, and a Washington, D.C. cop came along and basically arrested her. There's a picture of her somewhere being carried off by this big burly cop, and here he's got Alice Paul, probably didn't weigh 90 pounds, dripping wet. Well, they threw her in the can, they arrested her and threw her in jail on a charge of prostitution. Now, President Wilson had, he was driving in and out of the White House all the time, and he kind of got used to seeing her there. Then one day, he didn't see her there, and he asked around what happened to Alice Paul. And somebody said, well, she got picked up on a charge of prostitution, which Wilson knew was a lie. He knew that was false. Well, in the meantime, Alice Paul was in jail, and she went on a hunger strike. Well, she was just this tiny little person, and so this negatively impacted her health right away. Well, the Washington cops were the Washington Police Department, Washington, D.C. Police Department were really, really embarrassed by the whole thing. But rather than let her die, then we're going to let her loose. And rather than let her die, they force-fed her. And they essentially took a garden hose and shoved it down her throat and then used a stick to poke food down the garden hose and into her stomach. So you can imagine this is an extremely violent thing to do to this poor woman. But to make a long story short, which had gone on too far already, Woodrow Wilson got wind of all this. He found out what was really going on and insisted upon her release. And within a day or two, she was right back out there protesting again. So Alice Paul is a person that you may not have ever heard of before, but Americans owe her a tremendous debt of gratitude for her efforts. She acted upon her principles in protesting the war, but she also kept up women's suffrage as an issue. So the 19th Amendment was passed on August 18th, 1920, and so women get the vote. Now, some of you may be curious to know why I put women getting the vote first. I want you to be clear. The next issue is going to be prohibition. And these issues are parallel. The people who were involved in prohibition were also involved in women's suffrage. It was happening at the same time. The people are the same, and they're going on almost identically in parallel with one another. But with that in mind, let's go on to a little bit of image analysis. Is going to be the next slide. And let's take a look at what, in other words, I think this is like, it'll only take a minute, but I think this is like a really important slide. It shows you what's kind of going on in the minds of people at the time. And so just really briefly on this, and I think this is a really an image, a placard, a postcard sort of thing that you can see everywhere. And it really is thoughtful. And I thought this was a really a good way to like show you guys what was going on. What was going on in the minds of people. First, you can see the slide. For those of you guys who don't know, this is kind of Art Nouveau. This is very Art Nouveau in the way like it's being portrayed. So certainly 19-teens, 1920s. So what a woman may be and yet not have the vote. They could be a mayor. Well, out in the West, they could be a mayor. They could be a nurse, a position of tremendous responsibility in my view. I don't know if you guys know that or not, but I think it's a tremendous responsibility to be a nurse. Be a mother. The little symbol there, kind of silly, but it's passing the torch. And so there is a mother. Again, a position of tremendous responsibility. Hopefully everybody loves their mother. A doctor or a teacher, women could get an education. And there it is. Or a factory hand. Now, during World War I in particular, that was like a really big deal. You had to be out there working. You were part of the workforce during the war. The second half, what a man may have been and yet not lose the vote. Well, they can be a convict. You can be thrown in jail and not lose the vote. This second part of that is kind of reading from left to right. This is kind of unkind. It's not politically correct at all. But you can be a lunatic and still be able to vote. And what's the reason why? You're a man. You can be a proprietor of white slaves. Now, the little placard there, the little symbol that this guy's kind of holding up, it's hard to make out. But it's a woman with her face in her hands. She's got her hands over her face. And so a proprietor of white slaves, that means a pimp. Well, you can be a pimp and you can still have the vote. Unfit for service. Again, during World War I, that was a tremendous deal. You can be unfit for service in the war, and because you're a man, you still got the vote. Last but not least, you can be a drunkard. You don't know who you're voting for. You're just voting, but you're three cheeks to the wind, and you can't make it out. But you still got the vote. And what's the only reason why? Because you're a man. And so I thought that this was a really interesting evaluation. This is how people were thinking at the time. And so women did get the vote. But the first thing they voted for, or they were voting for this all along, was prohibition, which is the next slide. So, prohibition. Now, take a look. The 18th Amendment is going to be ratified in 1919, right at the same time as, basically the same time as women getting the vote and women's suffrage. And it's enforced January 16th, 1920 with the Volstead Act. Strong note here. The Volstead Act said you cannot transport alcohol without a special license. And the federal government was not going to issue that license. You cannot manufacture or transport alcoholic beverages for human consumption without a special license. And the license would simply not be issued. And that's the way the Volstead Act worked. It didn't tell people they can't drink alcohol. You're not going to be able to stop them. Drinking alcohol, consuming alcohol is actually not a crime. But having it, possessing it, transporting it, manufacturing it without a license, that is a crime. You can't do it. So that's the way the Volstead Act worked. So the next part of the slide, the result of a long-term grassroots progressive cause. Again, right along with women's suffrage, you get the prohibition movement. Now, there are two, it's on the slide really, but there are two unexpected allies to this. And I want you to write a strong note here. There are two strong allies. Number one, the medical profession. The medical profession is trying to improve their reputation. Had a really, really bad reputation in the 19th century. Colleges and universities were handing out medical license to anybody that can like pay them $50. And so here we are in the turn of the 20th century, going into the 20th century, and the medical profession is trying to improve their credibility. They're trying to improve their public image. And so the medical profession, they tied themselves with the Prohibition movement because that's kind of a low-hanging fruit. Everybody could see that alcoholism is like spectacularly bad for the individual. That's perfectly obvious. And so the medical profession came in and said, listen, you're going to get cirrhosis of the liver. You're going to get all these terrible, terrible things that are going to happen to you physically. And that can be medically proven. And so, yes, that does lend credibility to the medical industry. The second unexpected ally is big business. Big business said, listen, we're losing a lot of work time. And there's no meaningful beverage that men can drink on the job that is a substitute for alcohol. In other words, nobody wants to, stop and like brew up a cup of tea. Coffee, maybe, but not throughout the entire day. Plus, that's all really time consuming because you got to like boil it all up. The soft drink had not really been developed yet. That will be a consequence of Prohibition. So early in the morning, about 9 o'clock, sidebar, back in Europe, back in the old country, in Germany, people still do that. 9 o'clock, you have what they call broadside, and then you can like have a beer. So you send some kid down to the local bar, and he gets 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 bottles of beer, brings it up. Everybody has a couple of beers. At noon, 1 o'clock, you have lunchtime. You have another beer or 2. 3 o'clock in the afternoon, you have another beer, 2 or 3. Then close to quitting time, maybe you have another one. And so throughout the day, you drink, 4, 5, 7 beers. By the end of the day, you can imagine productivity has suffered dramatically. And the guys are like mostly drunk. They're all tanked up. And so, at the end of the day, they've had a hard day at work. They're like perfectly willing to go on strike or get into fights or, more importantly, destroy the machinery. And so big business said, listen, we're going to get behind this temperance movement. We're going to get rid of alcohol. We're going to attack the source. One other note that I want you to make, strong note here. It's not on there, so you're going to have to like write this one down. The adversary of Prohibition was obvious, and that's the alcohol industry, beer and hard spirits. The wine industry, the hard spirits industry, the beer industry. They would be the people that are against Prohibition, the natural enemies of it. The problem here is they never thought in a million years that Prohibition would actually pass. So they didn't organize and come out against it. They didn't fight against it. They didn't put up a fight. Women kept saying, listen, we're trying to lower domestic abuse. This was like a kind of a battle cry of Prohibition. Their husbands are like taking what little money they are making. They're going to get tanked up. They come home. They're very dissatisfied. And they take out all their anger and on their wives and kids. And so, there's like one cause after another that would drive Prohibition. Last, and I have it there in the middle, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and Susan B. Anthony, Carrie Nation, Josephine B. Hughes, and many others. But especially the Christian organizations, they're coming out against it. And they're unopposed. I'll talk about Carrie Nation in just a minute, in the next slide. So, once again, this is a constitutional amendment. And so you have to pass a bill in Congress, then it has to go out to the states, and then it has to come back from the states and go get voted on again. And that means as a constitutional amendment, everybody agrees with it. So by 1905, there are 3 dry states. By 1912, there are 9. And by 1916, 26 of the 48. Well, you're already over half the states, nearly half the states are dry already before the amendment actually goes to the states. So just a couple of more states have to agree with this, and you've got Prohibition, which is exactly what happened. So, statistically, there is a good side of this. Drunken disorderly is down 50%. Cirrhosis of the liver, the medical industry said, look, is down 60%. Mental disability due to alcoholism, down 60% by the decade of the 1920s. So, people are out there saying, listen, this did work. But there is a downside, a very serious downside. So let's do a little bit of image analysis, and then we'll take a look at the downside to prohibition. So here we go. Here's a little bit of just good old-fashioned American propaganda about it. We'll start in the upper left as we usually do. That's kind of my habit. I don't know if you picked up on that or not, and we'll just kind of go clockwise. So there you go. Prohibition is near at hand. Oh my gosh, stock up tomorrow. There's going to be a shortage of booze. So everybody get all, good and tanked up. I especially appreciated down at the bottom, you can say 5 cents for a glass of Burgundy and another 5 cents for a big giant thing of beer. So a 5-cent beer, wow, I had no idea about that. How are you going to wet your whistle? Okay, so I don't have any idea on this, but the artist evidently thought that to go get drunk, you need to have a top hat and a bow tie and a clawhammer coat and spats. That's the people that are going to go, those are drunks. I don't know. Help me to keep him pure. We got to get the children involved. Oh my gosh, we're going to do it for the kids. Don't do it for dad. Don't do it for mom. Do it for the little children. The nation has decreed national prohibition. We're doing it for the sake of the children. Enforce the law. This last slide is actually taken when prohibition ended. So here is a slide that shows that some bar or whatever, some establishment, says in compliance with the 18th Amendment, no intoxicating liquor allowed on the premises. But then everybody else is like celebrating the end of Prohibition, which was in 1933, and they're having a big old time. They are celebrating. They're going to get hammered. They're going to get drunk. The slide in the middle there and the slide on the lower left, this is Carrie Nation, the heroine of the hatchet. Her MO, her modus operandi, if you will, is to get a bunch of her supporters, go out to one of these western states, these western cities, and go into the saloon out there, smash up the place. You can see that in the cartoon. And then she would obviously going to get thrown in jail over this. Well, then all of her people, her supporters, would go around to all the women and go to all the churches and say, listen, we have this big giant protest because we got to get Carrie Nation out of the jail. She's out there crusading for this in the name of God. And you kind of see that in that picture there in the middle. She has the Bible in one hand and the hatchet in the other. I don't know if that's in keeping with Christian traditions or Christian values, but she's like saying that. So this leads to a dynamic that I want you guys to make a strong note of. We're doing a little bit of image analysis here, but there's a strong dynamic. Where women's suffrage started in the West and moved east as a dynamic. Prohibition begins in the East and moves west. Please make a strong note of that. Women's suffrage started in the West and moved east as a political dynamic. As a political dynamic, prohibition started in the East and moved west. It's the western states that are the last of the holdouts, especially California and Arizona. And you can imagine it's hot, it's dry, and the last thing you want is to get rid of your, this new development, ice cold beer. And so those states are the ones that held out the last. You can imagine that the South was actually really strong supporters of prohibition. It's the Bible Belt, and everybody, pitched in. They said, yeah, we can't have this alcohol anymore. The Northeast, that's where all the manufacturing was at. So again, they were pro-prohibition. The upper Midwest, well, they needed those states, but it's the western states that really pushed prohibition as a cause over to get the amendment passed. So with that in mind, again, there is a downside to prohibition. There is a downside. So the downside is crime. Strong note here. Your textbook says this. Everybody who takes a look at this as a political dynamic, as a social dynamic, everybody agrees with this. The crime rate did not greatly increase. Strong note. In other words, if you were a criminal, you were already a criminal. But if you are not a criminal, if you're a law-abiding citizen, then you did not want to become a criminal. You don't want to do that. You don't want to go against the law. Nobody did. But if you are a criminal, you're already a criminal. The problem with Prohibition was it became much more profitable. Crime became profitable. So how exactly did this work out? Now, it's perfectly obvious, you already know this. The minute somebody says you can't do something, the first thing you want to do is go out and do it. I'm telling you as your instructor, you can't have any ice cream today. No ice cream for you today. Well, immediately, everybody that just heard me say no ice cream today, all you were thinking about is where am I going to get some damn ice cream? You wanted it right away. So the minute that everybody says you can't have alcohol, everybody immediately wanted to go out there and do it. Now, this is a straightforward supply and demand situation. As soon as the demand went up, production of alcohol also went up. The supply went up. But obviously, you couldn't get a license to do that because of the Volstead Act. So everybody started making bathtub gin, and we'll talk about that later. And more importantly, you started getting it from Canada. You started getting it from different resources. Yes? So then the supply went up. But because of the Volstead Act, you're actually charging a lot of money for that alcohol. Demand is way up. Supply follows that. But you're making a lot of money on that because of the Volstead Act. It's illegal, so you got to pay a little bit extra for it. Well, after a while, strong note now, the demand collapsed. People were like, listen, I actually was not an alcoholic before, and I don't want to be one now. Plus, this cheap second-rate booze that I'm getting is nasty. And so demand collapsed. And with that, supply went back down again. Then demand went up and went down again, and there's a little bit of a kind of a jagged line, if you can think of this as a supply and demand curve. It's a little bit jagged, and then it levels right out. The people that were getting alcohol, that were using alcohol before, are using alcohol afterwards. So when we talk about Prohibition, it's just this straightforward supply and demand model. Demand goes way up, then it goes down, then it goes up again, then it goes down again, and it kind of levels out. So when we talk about the guys that you're seeing here, crime, what we're really talking about is turf. We're talking about the supply. We're talking about the people that are actually doing the wholesaling, not the retailing. So there are two fights. You're fighting over turf. You're fighting over turf wars. That's the big fight. The second fight, which is really unexpected, is over trucks. That means, in other words, you need to be able to transport your alcohol. Trucks were a new development. The internal combustion engine had always been way, way, way too weak for trucks. So now we have a new development in the 1920s. What makes the 20s roar? Prohibition. The other thing that makes the 1920s roar? Crime. What makes the 20s roar? The development of the truck. In other words, you can't use the train to transport alcohol. The railroads won't put up with it. You're not going to be able to do this with a horse-drawn wagon. It's not fast enough. You don't have enough capacity. You can't really do this with cars, although that did happen. So you have specially developed cars that'll be, can put up with the extra weight, and they're going to have hotter engines so they can go faster. But still, you just don't have enough capacity. So you have a new development in the automobile industry, which was not driven by Prohibition. It wasn't, but that's where the demand is at. These criminals, they want trucks, and they're always going to be fighting and fighting and fighting to get control of trucks. So let's take a look at some of these guys. There's Scarface Capone. He is the icon. He's the absolute icon of this. He had been a criminal. He fits our model perfectly. He had been a small-time criminal in New York. Got into a fight and killed a man. Well, the mob there said, listen, you're too hot for New York, so go to Chicago. Well, he arrived in Chicago just in time. Prohibition takes off, and as far as anybody knows, Al Capone never personally sold any alcohol to anyone. No one saw him ever do that, ever. But he's a wholesaler. He's controlling turf in Chicago. He's part of the South Side gang. There's other gangs, the Purple Gang. There's all sorts of other gangs that are going on in Chicago. Strong note here. These crime gangs are in every town and city in America. They're on the West Coast. They're in Dallas and Fort Worth. They're in St. Louis. They're in Miami. They're in New York. These crime families are running this alcohol business everywhere. The problem in Chicago was they couldn't work out a deal. They couldn't divide it up. Everybody was fighting over this all the time. There were all these little turf wars. In New York, the crime families I'll say more about that with the next slide. They worked out their problems, and they made a deal. On the West Coast, same thing. They worked it out. They made a deal. And that got rid of all of this crime, all of the murders that were going on. But in Chicago, for a variety of reasons, they simply couldn't work it out. So again, the downside, Dutch Schultz. There he is, and next to him is his death certificate. And if you read it closely, he says he's listing his occupation as a salesman. Well, I bet he was a salesman, but he was moving alcohol. And the cause of death, multiple gunshots and wounds to the head, neck, and shoulder. And so he was gunned down in the streets. You go down to the next slide down at the bottom. Okay, this is actually a crime scene photograph. In other words, what you're looking at is not a fake. It's not a movie still. This is the death scene at the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. And so here we are. It's February 14th, 1933. These guys are in this garage. The hit was to be against Bugs Moran, whose picture's next door and is right next to it. And so Bugs Moran was being staked out by Al Capone. He goes into this garage. Al Capone gets the phone call saying, hey, we saw Bugs Moran go into the garage, and Capone gives the code word, yeah, we'll go in there and kill him. Fine. So some guys dressed up as cops go into the garage. They say, listen, you're all under arrest. We're going to do this thing, and you guys are done for, and get up against the wall. Well, the cops are actually criminals dressed up as police. They take a half a step back. Some other hitters come in, and the result is what you see here. Now, it turns out Bugs Moran was not there. He'd been misidentified. But they're in a garage where they fixed trucks. That's what was going on in the garage. And these guys were keeping an eye on the trucks. Again, a lot going on around that. So that explains that. But this St. Valentine's Day Massacre thing, this demonstrates conclusively to the nation that the solution to alcoholism, prohibition, the solution was worse than the disease. And so in 1933, December 1933, prohibition is repealed. It's the only constitutional amendment to be repealed. The solution, the Volstead Act, was worse than the disease. One other thing I want you guys to take a note of, again, the downside of this is unexpected, but it should not have been unexpected. And that is taxation. Alcohol had a tax upon it. It was heavily taxed, both beer and hard liquor. But the minute that you made the production and possession and transport of alcohol illegal, then you can no longer collect taxes on that. And so this huge giant revenue stream was suddenly cut off, immediately cut off. And so this is it's a terrible downside. The states were like scrambling to raise taxes on other things to cover for that budgetary shortfall. One other downside, it's not on there, but one other downside. The nation became a nation of what's called scofflaws, S-C-O-F-F. S-C-O-F-F. Scoff, to scoff at something, is to disrespect it, to not pay attention to it. So here's a nation that said, listen, you told us we can't have our alcohol. Immediately we're going to go and get drunk. And so people became lawbreakers. And that meant that other people were supplying alcohol. And they're lawbreakers as well, and they're getting away with it. And because crime is so profitable, you can simply buy off the cops. You can buy off the prosecutors. You can buy off the judges. And so nobody's going to jail. Well, think as a society how dangerous that is. If people can systematically disobey the law and get away with it, what other laws might they be prepared to break and get away with it? If you have law enforcement and prosecutions and judges out there that are willing to take payoffs because of the vast amount of money that's involved, what else might they take a payoff on? So there are very serious downsides to this. Now with that in mind, let's go to the next slide, a little bit of image analysis. You guys know how I feel about that. So here we are, just a little bit of image analysis. Here are the hitters. And, take a look at these guys. Machine Gun McGurn. You can imagine what his tool of choice was. In the middle there, Frank Machine Gun Kelly. He's all chained up, and there he is. Well, you guys are not going to believe me when I say this, but it's perfectly true. Back in those days, you could order a submachine gun. The weapon of choice was called a Tommy gun, a Thompson submachine gun. They're still in production today, by the way. You can buy those things. And you could get them delivered to your home in the mail. They were only a couple $100 each, which back in those days was still quite a bit of money. You could buy a nice car for $300. So it was still a lot of money to get one of these machine guns, but you could have it delivered by the U.S. Post Office to your home. And they were selling these things by the box loads. So when we talk about these turf wars, we're talking about guys going out there and shooting up the streets with machine guns. In the upper right, Frank Clemente and Philip Magnano. These are two of the St. Valentine Day hitters. And sure enough, they had shotguns, but they also had machine guns. Frank Nitti, again, he's a hitter. He's a cold-blooded, steely-eyed killer. He used pistols, machine guns, whatever he got his hands on. In the lower right, the lower left, you can see Meyer Lansky, Charles Lucky Luciano, Sylvester Agaglia, and John Senna. And these are the guys that really set up the crime families in New York. And take a look at how these guys are dressed. They're top hats, or not top hats, but they have these nice fedoras on, overcoats, sparkling white collars. These guys are stone cold criminals. But because they're making a vast treasure of money, they can dress like they're making a vast treasure of money. And all these guys, take a look at them all. It's not one or two or three that are dressed like this. Clemente and Magnano, look at those guys. They got the long coats on, the fedoras, sparkling white shirts, beautiful ties. I wish I could dress like that. So what makes the 20s war? Prohibition. What makes the 20s war? The downside. What makes the 20s war? All this murder and crime that's going on. It's a negative, but it's exciting. It's dynamic. So with that in mind, let's go on, I think, to the last slide here. So that ends 1920s Part 1. Please go to 1920s Part 2. It's listed, and we'll talk about some of the more positives. We'll talk about economics. We'll talk about the film industry, the automobile industry. There are your readings right there. No matter what textbook you have, just use your common sense. Read everything that you need to read up on the 1920s. So thank you for your time, and I will see you in 1920s Part 2.